And to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I mean, as someone who grew up in the United States, whom in their school, their elementary school years, had to recite the Pledge of Allegiance ad nauseum every morning for class, it's engraved in the heads of millions of my fellow millennials, along with the older generations, Gen X, the baby boomers, the silent generation even, and even the handful of holdouts that are still from the World War II era, which seems so long ago. And obviously the younger people are being indoctrinated with that same sort of sentiment, I'm sure, no doubt, even though with the coronavirus, everything has been converted to online. But I digress. These words, I feel like, are just that, when at the end of the day, in terms of what they should stand for, should mean so much more. And what I mean by that is that for many people like me when I was a kid and had very little self-awareness or intellectual curiosity, at least for when it comes to political science and even just the current events that make up what we have when it comes to political discourse in the United States as far as we know it. And even when other countries, obviously they have their own version of that pertaining to their own cultural and geographic circumstances, along with their own political and economic ones as well. That's just part and parcel of societies. And as someone from the United States, as someone who has had the great privilege, honestly, of growing up in what was, at least the time when I was growing up, still a really great country that was not perfect by any stretch of the imagination and not great for everyone, but at least for someone like myself who was adopted and grew up in New York City, it was not bad. And for someone who has citizenship to a country, whom is culturally Americanized, but obviously ethnically Korean, and more broadly, I guess I fall under this umbrella term Asian American, which really is something that I don't think that most people should pay stock into. It's the same as white or black. At the end of the day, these are umbrella terms for subgroups that have so many significant differences and deserve their own highlighted understanding of. And just bringing them all together into this amorphous group, maybe sometimes it's more applicable, broadly speaking, when it comes to just the sake of academic work or even just having a story being written, because we all know that with our ever so shortening attention spans, that's just something that makes things short and sweet, and most people like it like that. But at the end of the day, I do think that they do, when it comes to at least understanding issues in a serious light, more harm than good when it comes to how people understand things. And I think when it comes to just the fact that someone such as myself has citizenship in a country, I think that that's not something that we all realize is a privilege that not everyone in this world enjoys. And it's something that we all, myself included, have taken for granted more times than we should have. And I think that it's easy to do so. It's not something to be ashamed of. I think that when you grow up, obviously children are very much inherently narcissistic, at least in the sense that when they're young, at least, their point of reference is their own experiences. And that usually influences and shapes their own political and even just social views when it comes to interacting with others. And obviously, a lot of people, the more intelligent ones, will obviously act in a way which helps them, academically succeed or succeed in their workplace or rise up the social hierarchy as it exists throughout, any respective society. And in particular, I guess I'll just refer to the things as they are in the United States from my own experiences. But be that as it may, you guys get the drill. But many people across the world, more than you would think, have their own, their own existence as a people and as a more sophisticated ability to, I guess in the sense, lack of vision, what should I say? I guess in lack of a better term, their ability to create have their own right to self-determination, a right which the United States has, from World War I to even the present day, claimed it champions and is in favor of when it comes to the ability for countries to choose their own path and have their own sort of styled, Jeffersonian democracy, at least when it comes to the principles of the United States and the Constitution, which I think in practice typically are not reflective of whatever high ideals we all think we might have. And the reality is, at the end of the day, I think many average people have just accepted those for just being what they are. But the political class obviously perceives them nothing more as a formality, as window dressing, in the same way that the Roman emperors had still claimed that the Respublica was a republic, at least in the sense that we would consider it, or their ancestors had, when it clearly was an empire. And I think that that's something that has been true for many countries, where, just because they label themselves or say a certain thing, it doesn't mean that politically and that's directly what it is. And sometimes it's just, and like at least the postmodern idea, it's the idea that, sometimes they're literally the exact opposite of what they say. And you got to be able to see their actions and deduce for yourself whether they're lining up with what their words are. And oftentimes there's a lot of hypocrisy to be dealt out throughout all these different governments. And the power structures just exist like that, as there's incentives to act in that kind of way. People move up the ranks. And if you look at who's in the leadership positions in the United States government, it's no wonder that we have a situation that is as bad as it is during the coronavirus, and that, just overall has been bad for decades. And there's just been a decline when it comes to the capacity for the country to adapt and be able to demonstrate that it's competent and able to lead and be the hegemon of the world, which it has been since the end of the Cold War in 1991, when the Soviets had disintegrated, and the Russian Federation, as much as a lot of people still see it as a geopolitical threat, maybe there's some merit to that, but at the same time, they're nowhere near the superpower that the Soviet Union had been in its heyday. And clearly, I think that we're still living in the shadow of that period. However, though, there are now more pressing events that these distant memories really need to be kind of put on the back burner. They should be understood and not forgotten, but we can't let these periods influence and prevent us from reforming certain institutions and political structures, especially right now during the coronavirus pandemic. And I think there's a lot of reforms, and I think programs like that would be more harkening back to that New Deal period, or the period of Theodore Roosevelt or FDR, or any one of these people who at least tried, whether politically to the left or the right, to at least, tackle these problems in a way that they thought was the best. And sometimes there was different varying results, some presidents it was a hit or a miss, but at the end of the day, at least they tried. And there was a sense of commitment to the common interest of the public, which clearly has not been reflective of our government here. And I think that the United States government has been a large contributor negatively towards the situation now that I want to talk about, which I think this introduction has basically kind of built up towards, in the sense that I'm trying to show that as someone in the United States, it's very easy to be, since the country is so big, and I've been across the country, fortunately, to a decent amount of states, and have been able to see different parts of the country. And there's plenty of bubbles where if you're in one of them in particular, you can feel that everything around it is so encompassing that it feels the entire world is orienting itself to be at that particular location which you're at. Especially if you're in a place like Times Square, which was an hour away from where I grew up, which every time you're there, you do feel like you're in the center of the world. But at the end of the day, you don't want to have your perception of reality be skewered by what you're just seeing in your immediate periphery. That's something that's very easy to do, but I think that is something that we need to be avoiding if we're going to try to be analytical and think critically about these political discussions, and try to increase and heighten the quality of them, since it's very clear, according to our political leadership, looking at people like Trump or even Biden, that the degree of the sophistication when it comes to political discourse has not only decreased, but we are now just entering a period which, cults of personality are pretty much the driving force of what is considered electability. And the reality is substantive policy prescriptions, which should transcend just the left to right dichotomy, which I really feel like has just been unproductive and often puts people which have more overlap than they don't against each other, when the reality is left and right, there's a lot of populist sentiment, I think. And I feel like there can be consensus when it comes to certain policies and compromise. And I feel like with other issues where there's more disagreements with people, that can be sorted out. But I think that just starting off in that direction is better than keeping things in the way that they were when it came to Joe Biden and the neoliberal Obama era, which was more like Bush and Bill Clinton's presidency. And even then with Bush, which was awful, and Bill Clinton, Trump is now this fake kind of populism, which has largely done nothing but make. Listen, if Trump was was the president of Israel, I think we could be having a different conversation right now altogether. I would be saying that he was a pretty great president of Israel. He has a settlement named after him that is in this area of the West Bank that does not belong to Israel. It belongs to Palestine. And despite that, is currently being, annexed and really just illegally occupied, invaded. And that should really come as no surprise to people who are paying attention. But I think the issue is very hotly charged. And I feel like at a lot of times there's people that on both sides tend to overlook that there are people on both sides of the spectrum that to varying degrees don't fall under these monolithic umbrellas of just, the Jews or the Arabs. And at the end of the day, there's different perspectives that all these different parties have. There's extremists on both sides that obviously should be individually criticized and obviously been acknowledged for what they are, and not, sugarcoat things or just blindly take one side over the other. I feel like it's very easy, and especially if you're a part of the Arab or Jewish contingency of this issue in particular, obviously you would have more of a vested interest than someone like myself. And I think having an outside observer, whether it's just some random person like me on the internet or even other people whom I've seen who are talking about this, I think that having outside sources that aren't particularly sorry, the cat's just over here just doing her thing. Kitty, yeah, she's here. But in particular, when it comes to this issue, I think it's very easy if you're personally invested to sometimes look at this with blinders on. And I urge even those who are more inclined to do so. I understand where they're coming from. I can empathize, especially with the Palestinians in particular, but also with the more liberal Jewish people whom simply just want to coexist. And at the end of the day, for centuries, the Jews and the Arabs in this land, which had historically, up until the end of World War I, for centuries been part of the Ottoman Empire. And prior to that, the various Arab caliphates, whether they were Sunni or Shia, such as the Abbasid, the Mamluks, and the Umayyads, they had all taken a period where they've controlled that area to varying degrees. And even beforehand, with the Romans and the Macedonians, the Greeks, particularly the Ptolemies and Seleucids, which had several disputes for centuries during the Hellenistic period after Alexander the Great's death in 323 BC, where both of these factions under the dynasties which were started by Alexander's Diadochi, the generals whom had been Alexander's personal companions when he conquered Western Asia, which were Ptolemy I Soter, whom ruled over Egypt and had controlled parts of the Middle East, including this area, Palestine, which was known as Judea, the land of the Jews. And there had been Arabs that have lived there at that point, but they were mostly polytheistic. And these Jews in particular from that region of Judea were the biblical Jews, whom had actually created the celebration of Hanukkah due to the victory that they had in claiming independence during the Maccabean revolt, where they had tried to rebel against, I think, one of the heirs of the Seleucid Empire, which was created by Seleucus I, the victor, or Nicator, whom had been another one of Alexander's generals, who had founded an empire that ruled over what was then ancient Mesopotamia and today modern Iran and Iraq. But they had fought over that land, and even beforehand, since the days of the other ancient civilizations, such as the Babylonians and the Assyrians, the Jews in that area had existed, and they've been there as a peoples, and their existence has been recorded as such. Their second temple actually was burnt down during the reign of Vespasian, and his son, whom would become another emperor after him, Vespasian, around 70 AD, would Titus would crush this Jewish revolt that attempted to once again, until this period now that we're living in, really, or the period that just followed up to this time, where the Jews would have an independent state, or at least an attempt to reach territorial independence. And this is Kitty, by the way. She's just all over the place. This area, in fact, had been a region which for centuries had been a contested area of geopolitical interest for the great powers of the time. And for centuries, actually, the Jews would be under the occupation of different foreign imperial states, such as the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, and then the Arabs, obviously. And there had been I said originally that the last attempt of Jewish independence was during the reigns of Vespasian and Titus. But no, actually, I just remembered. I'll have a separate video on this in particular, because I think it's an interesting topic that hasn't been as discussed, and which I was surprised from other people who talk about Byzantine history, which is the 614 Jewish revolt against Heraclius, which occurred during the end of late antiquity and the transition to the Middle Ages, during the broader Byzantine-Sasanian War of 602 to 628, where the Romans and Persians had their final dispute and conflict, which would result, obviously, in history, which I'll talk about in another video. But the Romans won, obviously, spoiler. But that revolt happened during that conflict, and that was the last revolt that the Jews would actually have in an attempt to create an independent state until the 20th century, when the Ottoman Empire had collapsed. And prior to the Ottoman Empire collapsing, there were deals made behind the scenes, mainly with the British government, which had, during this thing called the Balfour Declaration, pretty much agreed to, at the end of the war, when the Ottoman Empire would have been carved up, to have a piece of that territory be allocated to be a Jewish homeland. And that happened over time. And during World War II, in between, since it didn't, I don't think, it wasn't established until after World War II, but during World War II, obviously the Holocaust happened, which was the horrific ethnic cleansing in Germany of the Jews and across Western Europe, which 100% happened. I think that when it comes to this particular event, it happened at the same time, though. Other ethnic cleansings have happened throughout history with different civilizations, and I think we should never condone or accept them. At the same time, though, we can't be naive and act like this was the first or going to be the last, as the Israeli state of today will be able to tell you, as I'll talk about in a couple of minutes. But first, now, obviously, when it comes to catching us up to that point, the Jews of after World War II, of Eastern Europe primarily, which were a diaspora since the Roman days, where they had broken up after the Second Temple, the mass Jewish population from Judea, and had sent them into different diasporas across the Mediterranean, which were the former Roman imperial holdings, to make it easier to manage them and to prevent them from trying to uprise again, But obviously, that caused them to start having their own enclaves in other areas. And that's why there is a testament to Jewish presence throughout Europe and Africa and the Middle East, all the way throughout the historical accounts of the times, the Middle Ages. And it's crazy that they've had such a long history and that they've been able to preserve their culture. And it's largely due to the fact, I think, that their mothers are the ones that determined whether they're Jewish or not. So even when they were under foreign occupation, unlike other cultures where the father is the one who decides, like your lineage is based primarily off of them, whether you're ethnically whom or what. For them, though, they were able to retain their cultural and ethnic Judaism. And obviously they intermix probably to an extent with local populations. But a lot of them, I think, stay quite closely knit. And if you look at Jewish culture and their inclination for academic rigor when it comes to their kids and how they're brought up and instilling a passion for education, it is something I think that should be applauded. And it's a clear demonstration and product of a culture that has been able to just get things right, and obviously there's caveats. I think that Israel, obviously, as a modern political state, has become an apartheid state. And I think that it's unfortunate. And I feel like at the end of the day, it needs to be said, obviously, before I keep going in, that the state of Israel is not indicative of every single Jewish person or their conception of what they believe to be what should be a Jewish state, whether it should exist or not, or whether, even if it does exist, what it should be operating as. The actions of this political state are in the hands of its military and political establishments, the Likud party primarily at the moment, but even like the Israeli Defense Force and all these bureaucrats and different types of players that behind the scenes are controlling the levers of power in Israel. Those are the ones who are making all these decisions. We can't just put broad brushstrokes into the groups of millions of people and assume that they're just going to be this amorphous kind of collective that all act in one way or not. And I think that that's something that should be acknowledged. But that shouldn't excuse or forgive the state of Israel, the government, the Netanyahu government, for what they're trying to do in the Middle East right now, which is, after the World War II, obviously, this state was actually created. And there were multiple conflicts where the Arabs had tried to essentially get rid of Israel. And Israel was, due to the aid they received militarily and financially from Western powers, especially the United States, had been able to defeat the Arab forces, which had bad leadership and had kind of just not been able to show, like, they had pre-modern weapons, and Israeli weapons and strategy were just better in the sense. And they had been able to just outdo all of their enemies. And they were able to, in two different wars, I think the Yom Kippur War and the Six-Day War, had been able to take large swaths of the Golan Heights, which they still occupy from Syria today. They took the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, which they gave back in between now and then. And for the West Bank, which was supposed to be this area that was supposed to be allocated, according to the United Nations, primarily the international community, so-called, which is pretty much France, Britain, and the United States, and maybe even Germany at this point. But these types of people whom had decided that the British would, the Palestinians would have this area that's in between Israel, the Israeli state, and Jordan, which would be Palestine, which historically was the name of the Roman province, but at this point had been the national identifier for the local indigenous Arab population, which had been there just as long, for centuries, as many of the Jews, whom some of them even longer, since a lot of these Jews actually migrated from Eastern Europe, but even the native Jewish populations had been living alongside these Arabs for centuries without conflict and had been able to peacefully coexist, many of them being family, friends, neighbors, and just people that they understood, they lived different lives, but they could accept the fact that they were there and that this was their land. They all had a stake to it, and they were one community. And I think that shows that this conflict for the last several decades, almost now a century, and as of 2050, which hopefully by then things will get better, because right now they're getting really bad. Right now the situation is just really bad. And I think it's something that makes me really appreciate not only my citizenship, but also want to advocate for the Palestinians to be given a fair and way better treatment. I think the Palestinian people, given all the caveats, and I think that there's a lot of things about Jewish culture which should be understood for what they are. And even a lot of people, there's a lot of these people who believe in these conspiracies about Jewish people. And I think that it's easy to fall into these beliefs. But the reality is, just due to their culture and a lot of other things, just because of how they've for centuries been able to keep themselves kind of in a mindset where they're able to survive and flourish and be able to adapt to their circumstances. And especially given that there were a lot of times that persecution happened. These people, I think, deserve a homeland in some way. But at the same time, I don't think the homeland should be at the expense of the Palestinian Arabs, whom had been there themselves for centuries. And I think that if the United States is truly this republic that stands for liberty and justice, we have to stand up. And I think Trump needs to take a 180 and stop doing what he's been doing, making the capital of Israel, or the consulate for the United States, the embassy, moving it from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem when the peace deal wasn't even decided yet, was outrageous and unnecessary. The Israelis actually named a settlement after him, and then had coins where Benjamin Netanyahu had conflated Trump with Cyrus the Great, the Iranian Shah, King of Kings, whom had freed the Jews from their Babylonian oppressors when he had started the Achaemenid dynasty of Persia all the way back in the ancient times. That is just ridiculous. Comparing Trump or any modern leader, even the idea of just doing that is ridiculous, especially since Israel and Iran have had this very bad relationship from the inception. And I understand that the negative feelings on both sides are clearly due to their own geopolitical interests differing. And I think that at the end of the day, unfortunately, as seen in history with Iran and their previous relationship with Jewish people, and having there be Jewish people in Iran still, I think that this situation, there is so many different complicated layers, and it's easy to just fall into one of these other camps where you're pro-Israel or pro-Palestinian. I think as someone who's literally not someone who has a personal stake in this game, instead of trying to just completely say I'm one or the other, I think that, like other people I'm encouraging, I think we need to start looking at things in a way where we're not going to create this utopia where everyone's going to get what they want exactly. But I think we can create a better situation where I think at this point, on a personal level, should be a one-party state, a one-state solution where the Israelis make these Palestinian Arab citizens and give them the same rights and treat them equally under the law, which, listen, then they can have the land. I mean, at that point, if there's this one government, they can have the land. But at the end of the day, they need to start treating the people on this land with respect and protecting their rights, not just completely marginalizing them and turning them into second-class citizens, and essentially having the equivalent of the apartheid state that South Africa had in the 20th century. This is an unacceptable situation. I think it's very difficult for anyone who actually has a conscience to really just see what's going on with the Israeli plan. I mean, they had with the United States, unfortunately, the Trump administration, as unfortunately he represents me and millions of other Americans, despite I didn't personally vote for him, and despite millions of people who even voted for him, not really voting for him to put Israel first over the United States. And it seems like in this case, he is burning bridges with the Palestinians, decreasing the United States' credibility to actually be a credible mediator in this peace deal that should be something that everyone should be collectively interested in, which Netanyahu has clearly shown he is not interested in. And anytime he has made any sort of symbolic overture, especially when Obama was president, it was mainly just to bide his time and wait till a Republican, someone whom is even more in the pockets of AIPAC and the Israeli lobby in the United States, which has influenced the foreign policy of the United States, at least, to completely just take the Israel position over Palestine. And I think that even regular Israeli people understand, thousands of them actually went out to Tel Aviv to protest, that Netanyahu has completely overstepped his authority as the prime minister, serving 5 terms. His nickname actually, I think, has been called King Bibi over there. He's really just a dictator, but he uses the guise of democracy, just like the Caesars had used the guise of republicanism during the empire, to mask the fact that this guy is just a sociopath, a dictator whom has used his authority in a way, abused authority, has been accused, and I think most likely his family has been all involved in these deals of corruption. The fact that he's so willing to suspend these trials makes me believe that he has something to hide. I don't trust him. I don't think he's earned anyone's trust. I think he's completely betrayed the trust of the Israelis, actually, in the sense that he right now has completely turned a blind eye towards the coronavirus and how it's crippling the economy of Israel at the right now. And plenty of Israelis or Holocaust survivors or new Holocaust survivors, and or people that actually suffered historically, the people that this country claims to be representing in a positive light, a lot of them are being left neglected. And it's a shame, because this government, the Likud party, seems like it's more interested in annexing territory that should belong to other people. And I think that if they really want this territory, they need to actually treat their citizens, with the people there, with respect and actually integrate them. And it's clear, obviously, that that's not going to happen anytime soon, especially not under the Likud party, because of the fact that their entire policy is the antithesis, including the fact that there are Palestinian Arabs. I think like 1 in 5, 20% of the population of Israel. Correct me if I'm wrong, but they had limited political representation. I think they had 15 seats in the Knesset, and they're dwindling, obviously. And they've had so many restrictions and limitations. Formerly, Arabic actually used to be a language that was officially recognized in Israel. And I think that Netanyahu changed that. He has essentially turned them into second-class citizens and has neglected during the coronavirus the healthcare and just infrastructure of areas of Israel, which are predominantly populated by the Arabs, the Palestinian Arabs, which are part of the Israeli state. They can claim that, oh yeah, we let these people come from Palestine to work, hundreds of thousands of them during the day before the coronavirus was happening. But clearly, these gestures, are very insignificant when it comes to the fact that right now, if the United States doesn't start to change how it's conducting its foreign policy, if it continues to just let Netanyahu, in the words of Mike Pompeo, make the decisions, the new government make the decisions for how the lives of so many innocent, people that are just like you and me, who are just trying to figure out how to make their lives have, some sort of purpose and meaning, and just, make it, survive, live to see another day. Their homes are about to be bulldozed. Their territory is going to be forcefully annexed, ripped from them. Territory that was their homeland, that has belonged to them for centuries. It's just something that really, I don't think anyone, even people from that area, want to see. Netanyahu has completely just gone off the rails. And I think that he's a warning. This type of person is a warning to the United States. And I think also just a warning to Israel, the actual people of this country, that these people completely disregard the law. They don't give a crap about the rule of law. They're just going to do whatever they want, and they'll come up with some sort of bullshit excuse. But at the end of the day, they don't really think that much of the institutions that they claim that they're champion. Those things are just means to an end for them when it comes to their continual accumulation of power and consolidating their ability to not be accountable to anything and anyone, including the laws which they are supposed to be the insurers of. And it makes it just very difficult to treat anything afterwards when it comes to how this situation is. It's hard to, I think, as someone who's rational, sympathize with the Israelis, at least when it comes to their government. The people, obviously, as I said, have been completely neglected. But unfortunately, a lot of people see the actions of the government, and they'll put everybody in this pool where things become all too easy to just kind of paint it like a football game where there's one good guy and one bad guy, and it depends on what side you're on. When at the end of the day, we're all just people. I think that these people, despite being thousands of miles away, despite me not really knowing any of them, I think, and not really being able to truly say that I understand how they're going through, because I don't think anyone other than these people right now, we can try to understand, but at the end of the day, having your, like, the area that you grew up in, that you've spent your entire life in, where your ancestors have been for centuries, where your people have been, and you've developed this culture and this love for the land that you're a part of, for that to all be just forcefully ripped from you, and to have this country that's supposed to be the United States, this world hegemon, to this beacon of just, Western civilization, this great democratic so-called republic, which values liberty and justice for all, just like, as I said during the Pledge of Allegiance in the beginning of the video. That country is just going to now let Israel basically ethnically cleanse and erase Palestine as a geographical, political, and just cultural, and even societal fact of reality, and essentially just wipe them out. And I think basically this is just really ironic, especially considering the plights that the Jews had suffered during the 20th century. And it seems like the oppressed can very easily become the oppressors. And it's just a warning, I think, when it comes to human nature, and how sometimes, I think we're all capable, just as much as we are when it comes to wanting peace, to either condoning or letting war go by. And I think that as someone from the United States, someone who votes, someone who participates and tries to keep up with current events, this matters, and it's something that the United States, it could theoretically prevent, and we're going to just let this happen, and we're not going to even try to advocate for something that I think realistically would be something that a lot of people would be in favor of. If the Palestinians were able to be a part of a state where they actually were, if Israel was this multicultural, multiracial, democratic state, which was supposed to be at its founding, which has pretty much morphed now into this fascistic, not even fascist, just like this, despotic, ethno-religious state, where they're just going to basically bulldoze all these settlements that belong to the Palestinians and then resettle them with people that will not really care for the plights of the local people, and just kind of participate in erasing this entire group of people from the lands that should belong and have a stake in. I think that's something that is just something that is awful, honestly. And it's just something that really we should all just try to ponder, and actually not just ponder, but advocate for the people who represent us, our congressmen, our senators, and all these other people, to actually do something about this. Like, why are we letting this happen? Like, why is this happening, honestly? It's just something that really is not right, honestly. I think that there's a lot of things, you can argue and dispute. There's just some things in your bones, when you see them, you realize that this is just really fucked up. And it's just like, it's hard to just watch, honestly, and like realize that this country, I mean, our tax dollars, if you're in the United States like me, we're indirectly contributing towards the immiseration of hundreds of thousands of people. And it's just a fucked up situation. And I think that we need to start really reconsidering and holding our leaders accountable, and actually paying attention and understanding that these problems aren't just these people's, and it's thousands of miles away, out of sight, out of mind. It's that we're indirectly letting this happen. And when we are just complacent, and understandably, there's a lot of other things. Everyone has a full plate, especially now during the pandemic. But when we want to understand why the system has completely failed to even help us out, it should be only noted what types of causes and projects the United States government, both parties, the Democrats, Republicans, what they're investing their time and the financial resources and political capital into doing. And when you notice these states like Israel, like Saudi Arabia, these states that really oppress their own people and are just different forms of dictatorships, which the United States claims to be against. And at the end of the day, dictator really is just a term which, depending on interpretation, historical perspectives, and where you're raised. I mean, at the end of the day, it's negative epithet, which I think in this case, just due to the irony of a lot of people really calling their competitors the opposite, like, Iran's a dictatorship, when the reality is all these different countries are not free countries. The United States is not a free country. Neither is Israel. Neither would Palestine or any of these countries. These are all different types of systems that, they might be governed ostensibly through different means, but the power dynamics, relationship-wise, are clearly not representative and proportional to what the actual people are really, the people would actually want to be inclined to be in favor of. And in fact, that's why I think Congress and even the approval rating of many of our presidents has never been at super duper great. And even the better ones that have been able to use their cults of personality, like Obama, whom had been able to have an all right, approval rating, and even Bush now, whom seems to be the media seems to be trying to rehabilitate, which is just disgusting, honestly, because he's a war criminal. But the fact that we prioritize all of these different things here, I think that we need to start moving away from wedge issues. And when we start criticizing foreign policy and just different sorts of things that are systemically tied to what the United States' political identity is and how its perception is across the world, as we try to believe that it's a beacon of freedom, when as of recent, in a lot of ways, it's, at least in the Middle East, when it comes to the Palestinians, become clearly a force for evil, honestly, when it comes to not really being the mediator that the United States could be. And if the United States has the potential to reform, if we have a better leader, honestly, which we're probably not getting with either Biden nor Trump, it's just a shame, because this could be a different situation altogether if we just had, a real leader, someone who actually can empathize and think rationally. I don't think that could be me. I don't think that could be Trump or Biden. I don't think that person might not even exist, honestly. But hopefully down the road, someone like one of the Roosevelts or, Lincoln or someone just is able to, or Washington, somebody just be able to hopefully change what the situation is. Because right now, when it comes to Israel, for example, this plan for peace that Trump had let Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, whom is Ivanka's husband, obviously, work with Netanyahu to craft this plan for peace you can see on the White House website, which I'll link in the description below. But it's not really an actual plan for peace. It's more a roadmap for annexation of the West Bank, which is supposed to start in July of 2020, this year. And if things don't change, they will. Netanyahu, ever since his brother died, Yotam, in the 70s, seems like he has just a bloodlust for just getting rid of Palestinians, unfortunately. And really, he understands. He's a smart dude. He's, as bad as he is, an intelligent guy. And he knows that depending on whom wins the 2020 election, it's a coin toss, I think, at this point, depending on how much less awful Biden or Trump can be compared to the other. But he knows that if he doesn't start doing this annexation of the West Bank in the summer, if he chances whom wins the presidency, there's a small chance Biden might not let him, even though Biden has said in the past that he is a Zionist, and in Congress, in the Senate, has attended AIPAC when he was a senator. And I feel like at the end of the day, maybe he would allow this to happen. But even if he didn't, Netanyahu's not going to chance it. He's going to rush and seize the moment. He's clearly using the coronavirus to evade justice by suspending the court trials that were supposed to have started earlier this month. And he's used the coronavirus as an excuse, and had appointed the justice minister, or person that was supposed to be in charge of making sure that there was oversight. Clearly, obviously, stacking the system with people that are just going to reinforce your corruption and not actually hold you accountable is just, another demonstration of someone who's clearly an autocrat, whom has no bones about it. It's pretty obvious, but I think that he doesn't care at this point, and he realizes he's been able to get away with so much, even like Trump and even like many of the corrupt politicians in Washington. And I'm sure in the Knesset there is plenty of corruption to go around as well in Israel. It's unfortunate, though, because right now the situation is, for the Palestinians, really dire. And I think that they deserve more support, and they deserve solidarity from people from across political spectrums who can understand that in this situation, as much as the Jews have come to love the story of David versus Goliath, which I personally am a fan of, where the little David, who would become king, the first king, I think, of the Jews, had been able to slay the Philistine Goliath in a duel which seemed like all the odds were in Goliath's favor, as this mighty man whom was just seemed like a weapon of war was able to be knocked down in one fell swoop by this tiny guy named David, whom is the reason why many people are named David, actually. And he was representative of the Jew, and the Goliath figure was representative of the Gentile, or the non-Jew, in the biblical, in the Old Testament, and in the religious literature. In this situation, there is no way that you could compare the Palestine and Israeli relationship for the Israelis being the David. I mean, the Israeli government in this situation is Goliath, and hopefully in this situation, David will somehow, this Palestinian minority, which seems like its days are numbered, and it's going to be a perilous future if they do somehow escape, and maybe they're escape the if somehow by some miracle in July this doesn't happen, which I'm not optimistic towards. There's only so much that the outside world can do, and I mean, there's only so much people like me who even are paying attention can do, which is really unfortunate. But even if they do survive, the conditions that they've been having to deal with, especially in the light of the coronavirus, are really just abysmal. They don't have stable access to basic utilities such as running water, electricity, and the resources of modernity that even some of the poorest among us in the United States are able to enjoy. Someone as myself in the middle class have been able to obviously take for granted. And it's just really an awful situation in the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank. And it seems like the Palestinians are being pushed to the edge. But hopefully, if history has been any indicator, somehow, some way, maybe the situation can get better. I'm not optimistic, but we'll have to see. And hopefully you enjoyed this video where I gave my little bit of a perspective, which is just, an opinion. I'm just one random person with an opinion. I'm curious to hear what you guys think actually as well. Comment below, and hopefully this video can help encourage a thoughtful, productive, and healthy conversation, as I'm not looking to try to rile up fanatics or have a debate with people whom clearly are not going to turn the blinders off towards their own particular biases and realize that there is a complicated situation here. These are adult conversations that are all too often, as of recently, taken as childish games where it's either one or the other. And if you're interested in that type of thing, please subscribe to another channel and get the fuck off of here. I'm not going to deal with that. But anyways, hope you enjoyed. And if you did, subscribe, and I'll catch you guys in the next video real soon. This has been Tom. You've been watching youtube.com/GetNuanced, and I'll see you guys next video real soon. Peace out.